Well, good afternoon. Welcome here today for a new event of Image Behind the Image, or Sanjian Toshe in Chinese. Today we have two guests. It's on one hand Biljana Ciric and Liao Wenfeng. And we will say a few words about the two guests, and then we will go into the talk.
So today, after yesterday, I don't know if you were there, we have this interesting talk about. And there are some chairs here.
Okay. Okay, again, now we start really, and again, very welcome to be here. And today, after yesterday, we had this interesting presentation about public space, this discussion. Today it's about a related topic to public space, which about intervention, curating as intervention. And Biljana Ciric, curator, independent curator from Shanghai, she will give a talk about her curating concept. And then there will be the discussion or a talk between Liao Wenfeng, artist living in Berlin now, but from Shanghai, between both of them. And now we introduce, or we say some words about you, and then we give.
All right, I start with Biljana Ciric. She has been living in Shanghai for 12 years, or in China for 12 years, and she's a specialist in the contemporary art in Shanghai especially, but also in whole China. She graduated from the East China Normal University. Originally she is from Serbia, but she graduated in Shanghai, in East China Normal University, and was director of a curatorial department at the Shanghai Duolun Museum. And then she curated a very, very interesting art, Intrude. This was public art in Shanghai in 2007, and it was with the Zendai Museum, and there should happen every day of 1 year an intervention from another artist in Shanghai, and this was a very exciting experience, and maybe we can hear something about that. And she's not only not okay, but that was very, very interesting thing, how to deal with public art in Shanghai. And but she's not only in Chinese art; she's also very specialist in the art of Indonesia and Vietnam and Cambodia, and took these impressions or her knowledge into Shanghai and gave it to the public and showed it to the public, which is very important as well. Recently, in 2011, she co-curated art in Manchester, of the Asian Triennale in Manchester 2011. And today we are very happy to have her here to give us an inside view about her work of curating today.
Okay, so I will introduce Wenfeng Liao, or Liao Wenfeng. His hometown is from southern China, in Jiangxi province, and he degreed from the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou, from the Total Art Studio, which you might have seen the Zhou Zhijie's presentation in January. And then he was living and working as an artist for many years in Shanghai. That's also where both of them get to know each other, and they work together on the project Intrude, for example, and on other projects, because Wenfeng, he was working at the Zendai Museum of Modern Art in Shanghai for many years, and did his and then he participated as an artist also in some international residencies, like in Switzerland, in Artist in Lab residency, in Finland, in the Hayab residency, and took part in different exhibitions, like in Nanjing Triennale in 2005 in Lianzhou Photo Festival. I've forgotten which year, 2008 or something. And yes, just to name a few exhibitions. And he curated actually, or he organized this film screening, which you got an insight before. And after the presentation, it will be again shown. And there are 7 artists, young artists from Beijing and Shanghai showing their work. So, and they sent it just actually for this presentation extra here. Yes, their video works and action works in performance work in the city. So I think now we give over the word.
Yeah, you can come. There's some more chairs here if you would like to have a seat, maybe. Thank you, Andreas and Binya, for introduction. No problem.
Just put some chairs over there.
Yeah.
In case
So, as I said, thank you, Andreas and Binya, for introduction, and thank you to Liao Wenfeng making this small selection of the video works of young artists, which I think they're a new generation of artists that came to the scene in last 5 years as a kind of introduction to my practice. So we will have again the screenings for the ones who came a little bit late after my talk. So don't leave right after. You can see more of the works. So today I am not going to talk about Intru that Andreas mentioned, because this is one of the projects that was initiated by a museum that I was asked to curate. And I'm not going to discuss about these problematics of this specific project, which was actually art in public space related. But I'm going to talk about a few projects that kind of in the last 5 years shaped my curatorial practice. I am originally from Serbia, and as Andreas mentioned, I came to China in 2000, and I did my master's in Chinese art history in East China Normal University in Shanghai, and I didn't do anything contemporary art related. My master's was on Tang Dynasty female imagery, which is 6th to 8th century. But I started working in a museum in 2004, which is this state museum called Dongdong Museum of Modern Art. If you look back at the early 2000s, it's one of the, it's a very interesting period of contemporary art where these museums started appearing as the mushrooms, and many of them closed, but there is certain dynamics start to appear that are still consistent till today. And it's a very unstable system. So I started working in Dongdong in 2004 as an intern, and then later on I established the curatorial department, and I ran the exhibition program and education and artist in residency program. And that all worked till 2007, late 2007, early 2008, because the director who wasn't from the bureaucratic system in the museum, he was asked to resign, and then I finished my program till the end of the year, and we all left. But I am starting with this short introduction of my background, because I think this experience working inside an institution was very important for me, and I think certain thinking about institutions and institutional structures and what I as a curator can contribute to actually is still existent in my practice. When we used to work in the museum, we actually work very closely with the local art community, and I think at that time we were I think one of the few institutions that in China that has a certain trust and belief from the local art community, which I think it's till today the same, because a lot of institutions and their work with artists, it's very much business related, so exhibitions are done through the galleries, etc. So after I left the institution in 2007, that was actually my first job properly right after the school. And it was a very important period of me understanding if I want to stay in China, what I can do actually as being independent curator, because I decided not to work for an institution anymore. And what I as an individual actually can contribute to the local art context. And these kind of questions actually I keep asking myself all the time till today when I want to do a project, especially in the local context in China. Of course, when you do international exhibition, then it's a little bit different problematics and the dynamics. But this kind of question is like, what does it mean to be a curator for myself, and in this specific moment, what kind of exhibition is relevant to be presented, and what kind of format, etc., is one of the issues that I still keep asking myself. And many of these conversations actually happen in a very close relationship and discussions with the artist. In a way, my curatorial work could be showed as described in Maria Lind's work as a context sensitive. So my work since 2008 goes in a few different directions that are kind of existing parallel. So I work very much with the younger artists, emerging artists, so-called, and I work a lot on the research on the local histories and the historical contexts. And I find it very important for me to understand the context where I work, because I'm there for so long. And another one is, since 2008 I started working and doing a lot of research in Southeast Asia. It came as a very organic to me, because these neighboring countries are very much influenced by China economically and politically. And in a maybe very hard saying, China is colonizing many countries like Vietnam and Cambodia through the investments, and Chinese, overseas Chinese, we call them Huaren, are the richest and the most powerful community in many countries in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, etc. So for me, it was interesting to see how the contemporary art context is absolutely disconnected between China and Southeast Asia. I think they have a more communication like China and West, so-called West or former West, and Southeast Asian countries with the West than they have between each other. So I was, throughout my projects and research, I'm still trying to act as a bridge. And then I work with international artists, so and try to present the work of artists that I think it's important, especially in China's specific moment, to present their practice in order to try to somehow bring in different dynamics and in the contemporary art context in China. So a friend of mine who I worked with many years ago, Susanna, is here, and I work with artists like Yoko Ono, and later this year we're going to open Tino Segal solo show in Beijing. So I'm going to choose a few exhibitions and the formats to talk a little bit more about this. So about the since I started working independent, I started in a way acting as institution on my own, and I think I developed certain strategies working with different institutions, because I don't work with the commercial sector at all, to bring in the projects that I think that they're interested. And as you know, most of the countries, including the China and Southeast Asia, they don't have a funding infrastructure that you have in Germany. So there is no IFA or anything like that. You can apply funding to do the projects or produce the exhibition. So many of the things that actually happen, they are really individuals' commitments, and they believe that these things are of importance to happen and produce a certain knowledge on a local level. So in last 3 years there was a lot of discussion related to the funding cuts in Europe and how the institutional structures are going to change in Europe. So when I was invited to curate the show in Manchester for Asia Triennial, I'm not going to talk about these problematics of Asia Triennial in Manchester because it's a very strange combination. But I proposed them to actually present the work of artists who are actually acting as institutions in the region. So they are basically acting as institutions, doing very different work beyond their own practice that kind of contribute to the local knowledge production. That again is, I think, very important for contributing to the global. Because I have a strong belief that the more global you want to be, the more local you have to go. So this is, I'm going to quickly show you some of the works. This is a work of artist from Austria. He's now based between Taiwan and Japan, Junyang. And he was invited to do a project in Taipei Biennale in 2008. And what is interesting, he produced this proposal for a Taipei Biennial to do a research project. Is it possible to have a contemporary art center in Taiwan? Taiwan's situation is slightly different from China because they have a funding structure, they have a council, and they have an alternative art center culture that they get the grants and money from the government, which is nothing like this in China, in mainland China exists. But actually Junyang, what he actually proposed, or as a proposal actually to the local art scene, is it possible to have an art center that is independent from the governmental infrastructure and the money, but still contribute to the local art scene. So he actually made this proposal, research proposal. A contemporary art center in Taipei is, should, could and would. And I think it's a very beautiful proposal to think of all of us. I believe some of you were artists, like a curator is, should, could or would, or artist. So he spent actually 2 years on this project, started working with the local art scene and understanding the dynamics, which is very difficult. And then they decided to establish the Taipei Art Center, TCAC. They got the building free from the real estate for 3 years. And they got the funding from the artist donations work. And all decision is made through the committee of the local artists. There is around 10 of them related to the program. They just recently, agreement expired, but they just moved to the new space, which is smaller, but they continue to exist. I'm just going to, Michael Lee, he's based in Singapore, and he recently had a residency in Berlin. He works a lot with the books, and he has a small studio called Studio Bibliothèque that does independent publishing, and they treat books as an exhibition format, and he's been doing a lot of important work for that. He proposed for my exhibition to have an X-Files. He asked artists or colleagues, including myself as well, to kind of reflect on our failed collaboration. As you probably know, we rarely publicly reflect why we failed to collaborate with each other. So, so these are kind of our facts, and there is one of mine as well inside. So, and these are some of his publications. And he made a also very beautiful video. I think many of these artists that I included in this show, they think of institutional structures and problematics of existing institutional structures and how they can actually contribute to their own practice. So he actually proposed through the video Consolation of Museology, proposing that we build up the museums of our own failures, because museums always kind of reflect of great achievements of our civilizations, but we don't have a museum of contemporary fools or whatever, because there was one of institution that he proposed, like Museum of Contemporary Fools, that you will see. Institute for Contemporary Fools, yeah. Rangrupa is a collective from Indonesia, and they're based in Jakarta. They do extremely important work. They have a small art space, and they have a residency program as well. And they worked absolutely out of the commercial context. And they established video Biennale, Video Art Festival, and some of the most important artist works, international artists' work, were actually introduced throughout their work. They do a lot of workshop with the students, and very, very important work. They also have a website, which is a digital journal on contemporary context in Indonesian society in general, etc. So I'm not going to show, but this is the archival material of their work. Rosisham Ismail Aka Isse is an artist based in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, and he has a small project called Parking Projects. Isse, he started actually in 2005 magazine that is actually till today the first bilingual English and Bahasa Malay art publication, and Setup actually was illegal till they were invited for Casa Documenta magazine project that was 2007. And then after the Malaysian government understood they have a magazine like this for already 3 years, they asked them to apply for ISBN number. And the one that you see with the barcode is actually the first official publication that have. But I see this, I think, exhibition, this kind of initiative as a very important in terms of archive. If you see in 10 years, it's a very important archive of Malaysian and Southeast Asian contemporary art scene, because there is very little about archiving and archival strategies that actually is going on at the moment in that part of the world. And then he has something called Parking Projects, because a lot of international curators would go to maybe China or somewhere else in the region, but would rarely stop at Kuala Lumpur. So what he does, he would hijack these curators and then invite them to Kuala Lumpur. He has a room where he invites people to stay, artists or curators for residency, to do a research and then present their work to the local art scene. So if you want to go, you should contact Ise. Richard Streatham at the Trend, he runs a small project space called Dia in Ho Chi Minh City. And it's an art exhibition space, but it's basically libraries on contemporary art and thinking. He has over 2,000 books, and it's basically a space where he provides reading and research facilities for the young artists, etc., which I think it's also a very important format that it doesn't exist. I'm not going to explain his work, but this is one of the, I think, most beautiful projects that came from China in the last 3 years. It's a Chinese artist called Hu Xiangqian, and he started doing these performances 3 years ago, taking his own body as a museum. So he would do live performances, sharing his own collection in his head with you. And most of the works that he has in his collections are either images or the work that he saw or the work that he heard, or etc. But I think it's a very interesting proposal to all of us, that we can all be a museum just if we want to be. This is his live performance. Yeah, and Vandi Ratana, he's an artist based in Cambodia, and he was in Documenta last year in the section called Cell, maybe if you've seen it, and his work was, in recent years, is very much about the history and importance of understanding the history in Cambodia because of the Khmer Rouge regime. Young generation is really not aware of what happened, etc. So when I was, and he's one of the very important young initiators of in the Cambodian art scene, and he has a space called, a small art space called Sasa Basak, that they show young artists' work. So when I asked him to reflect on the institution and his institutional structures and ideas, he actually proposed to me that we, during my exhibition in UK, that we build up the library on history books for his space in Phnom Penh. On any language, on any history. So we had like over a few hundred donations of the books that we sent back. These are some. So, and this project actually developed into the book that came out last year by Corner House, co-edited by myself and Sally Liao, who is the director of Chinese Art Center, that we invited the local and artists who were in the show and international curators and artists and thinkers to reflect on possible models for institution. And I think that many of them are the people who actually have been thinking about it for many years, and whose practice I follow very closely. So these are some of them that you might know. And I wanted to share one of it, which I think is quite beautiful and short, so you can read it, by Yoko Ono. She says, institutions like women must give out the feeling of trust and beauty. In order to do that, they must go to the next steps before anything else. First, clean itself. 2. Drop oil that smells good in all corners. Grow trees, bushes, and grass around the building. Paint the building in the color of early morning. Make sure the furniture is comfortable. Be ready with good water and simple food you can always give to the hungry. Have notebooks and pencils for people to write down their inspiration. Whatever you want to communicate with will be easily done in such an environment. So this is a project that kind of brings a few connections throughout my work, and the one actually that you've seen at the very beginning, this enormous timeline actually came throughout this project, and I just want to show you. It's a collaboration between me, Sun Yujin, he's a curator and scholar based in Singapore, and a scholar based in London called Alex Hodby. I think we have to put it really big so I can, where we actually, throughout our research, tried to map in important institutional changes or exhibitions, events, or political events that actually influence the understanding of contemporary practice or culture in the different localities, including Europe, Asia, etc. So it's a kind of a lifelong project, in a way, never-ending project. But I think again, I think it's important. It's a kind of reminder for us that although we so-called live in the global world today, our knowledge is very much fragmented. And I think this is a kind of an issue that always comes throughout my work. So you can see that we were actually trying to start from the colonial times, because in that part of the world, the introduction of so-called institutions and the museums, etc., came with the colonial time. Through very different changes till today. So this map, as I said, it's an ongoing map, and we keep inviting also different people to contribute from different regions, because, for example, I know very little about Latin American contemporary art practice or Africa. So it's, yeah, just for example, there is a 1905, it's the first Chinese entrepreneur who established a museum early 20th century, etc. So it's a kind of a live project that I hope will be online maybe next year. But I think it's kind of helped us to understand different modernities and different contemporaneities that are happening in a very different times in different parts of the world. In terms of the research in the local context, after I left actually museum, I started a project that was very important for me to understand a little bit further where I am and why I'm doing what I am doing. In 2008, I curated an exhibition called Rejected Collection, where I actually invited Chinese artists to give me their own rejected proposals. They could be rejected from, let's say, rejected because they were too sensitive in a way, but also rejected by international institutions like Pompidou or Tate or whatever, or too expensive or whatever. So I think for me it was important to understand not only what is there, but it's what is not there, because working as a curator in the museum, you deal with this issue of rejecting artists all the time, and all this proposal actually stay in the artist computers. But I think the idea of proposal and artists working throughout the proposal format is actually something that did not exist since the 80s, where Chinese avant-garde started. is actually started with so-called internationalization of contemporary art practice, which started throughout the mid-90s. So when I was starting doing the research throughout the 80s, I started interviewing a lot of senior artists and understand what actually happened and what not happened and what are the differences, which was somehow an entry point for me to understand historical contexts. And then it was interesting to see actually throughout these rejected proposals not only how the artist working methods changed, because after 2000 this proposal format is something very familiar with all of us, and artists keep proposing to the biennials, museums and galleries all the time their works. But also as well to see how the perception and the understanding of contemporary art change on the local ground and internationally, and what kind of exhibition and works were hoping to present it in, for example, on international exhibition throughout the 90s is quite different from after 2000, etc. As well. So I'm going to just show you one of the proposals. So some of them, later I published the book that you see in the cover, but this is a proposal from Song Dong. He's a quite important artist in China. He was also in Documenta. He had this piece on a grass area. And what he proposed in 2004 to one official opening, is to have 1,000 workers who will actually hold the stage while the officials are going to give a speech on the stage. And of course was rejected. But what actually he managed to do is actually to have a few hundred workers standing behind at the stage while the officials were giving the speech. And I think it's interesting to see what actually was the original idea for artists and what was actually made public throughout the exhibition or the event, which I think there's always a slight difference. And this kind of led me to a big exhibition that I did in 2009 looking at the Shanghai contemporary art history and its dynamics, because a lot of artists who've been active throughout 80s, maybe or 90s, they're not acting artists anymore, but they made a very important contribution to the local art scene. But today, like if you would ask the younger generation of artists, no one would know them or even know what kind of work they made. So I think throughout my work in terms of the local context, this certain protest against forgetting, as Hans-Ulrich Obrist would describe it, is always very much present, because I think it's very important to understand history in order to continue working. So this is the book that actually came at after these exhibitions. And this actually led me to bigger research that is continuing till today, and that's a history of exhibitions. As you know, that most of our history is written throughout a certain artwork, but we rarely understand this specific moment when this artwork is made public, and that's throughout the exhibition. And Shanghai, during these 30 years, has been very much, and mostly artists, I would have to say, were the most important curators who actually tried to challenge the existing exhibition format. So this is an exhibition organized by artists in '96, and it was a fax exhibition called Let's Talk About Money, where they actually invited artists from all around the world to send throughout the fax their ideas and thinking about the money. And I think it's very interesting because a few years ago a friend of mine did a similar show in US, but not knowing that this exhibition existed. And this actually research on history of exhibition continues till today for me, because I'm currently working on a book on the history of exhibitions in China from 1979, which starts from this Democracy Wall exhibition till more or less 2009, and further research on history of exhibitions in the region, China, Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, which is going to be a series of seminars starting this year in August as part of the Auckland Triennial, looking at the first early 70s and 80s exhibitions in that part of the world. And that's going to be published later, I think by Sternberg Press. So I'm just gonna show you a few. This is something that I showed yesterday as well. There were interventions 1986 of artists in Shanghai. 1986, also very important abstract exhibition. Black, White, Black. Yes, so I just want to also show you very briefly how does the archive look like. As you I don't know, do you understand, but there is no archival institution in China that works on this kind of archive. So for me, it's really important to get this information, primary resources, and kind of try to classify them. Now it's not public, unfortunately, but I hope one day it will be made public for people who are interested to do a further research on it. So I went through the artists one by one and interviewed them, tried to get all material, scanned it, etc., and then compile it into some kind of archive. This is 1980, called Grass Society, one of the first collectives in Shanghai. So I tried to collect whatever I could get, if it existed, including the artist invitation, posters, if they had any reviews, any kind of information, including the photos, the documentation on the exhibitions.
It's all about Shanghai.
This is the one that is all about Shanghai, the file that you're looking at, but now I'm compiling the one on China. So I've been doing recently an interview with the Beijing collective called Xinkedu, a new analyst group that existed from 1988 and 95, and they made a very, very different work. So it's kind of expanding, but though the ones that you're looking, they're China. They are the ones from Shanghai. This is 1985 painting exhibitions, and then even for some, for example, this poster for this exhibition was lost, but then I found out that actually artists painted these posters because they at that time didn't have money to print it, so I asked him to make a new one, and we could kind of archive it still. And the works from the exhibitions, and we also sat with artists. I sat with artists and made a floor plan of each exhibition, so to understand the dynamics in the space of each show, etc. This is one of the first photography collectives in China from 1986. They existed very, very short. This is one of the Chenzhen, is a very important artist. He moved after in mid-80s to France, but one of his first solo exhibitions actually was before he left to Paris. And this is documentation that I could actually get from this show. Yes. And I am going to talk briefly about the project that I did in 2010, because as I said, I work independent, so, and China has so many exhibitions, like and I think exhibition as a format is really consumed, and people really rarely question why this exhibition now, and what does it mean, etc. So around 2010, I was feeling myself, maybe I should start doing exhibition, because I just kind of contribute more to this over consumed field with like producing more and more. So somehow as a response to that, my exhibitions since 2010 became a very long and slow exhibitions when I work in China. So in 2010 I did a 1-year exhibition. That was an ongoing project that I worked with many different institutions in Beijing and Shanghai, looking at the line-based work and performative aspects in art. Because at the current situation, especially after 2010, many non-for-profit spaces closed. So at the moment, there is there are only very big museums, institutions that are working with very stable exhibition formats, and then there are commercial galleries, and none of those actually are showing live-based works. Like commercial galleries, they can't really sell this kind of works, and the museums, I think in China, they're more or less very afraid of, when you say live work, they think about the performance and getting naked and like cutting your veins or whatever. So I think the institutions are kind of afraid of the live works because it has a very different dynamic, etc. So I spent a lot of time trying to convince the museums and the theater spaces to host different projects and artists that I would like to introduce. And this project actually started, I asked a group of young artists who actually haven't done performance before to re-perform historical works that they found interesting or that they found that somehow influenced their own practice. And we basically worked over 2 months because many of the works, actual performance documentation, they haven't seen. Usually they see one photo in an art magazine, etc. So we spent time in getting the work and understanding what actually happened, etc. And then we produced a one-night event as a kickoff of this project called Performing History. And I'm going to go very quickly because I think I'm running out of time. So Hu Yan actually, he chose to Dan Graham's piece, Performer, Audience and the Mirror. And this is how it actually looked like. You can see the video documentation online. There is a website of the project, so if you wanna. And then Li Mu, he's an artist based in Shanghai. He did, of course, this legendary piece of Joseph Beuys, How to Explain Picture to the Dead Hair. And Li Mu's work was how to explain today to hair. And he was reading a lot of books related to the market and market economy, etc. And he had a live rabbit. Wan Sushun is an artist based in Beijing, and he was inspired by the John Cage event. Once when he was performing, he opened the door of the performance hall. That noise of the street kind of can contribute to the performance itself. And what Wan Sushun did is when I announced his project, he took his bag and left, and he never came back. This is of course Yves Klein's work, but Shanghai-based artist Tan Di Xin, he's been very much inspired by this work, and he's been trying to reperform it in many different situations. So this was actually, this photo is from the collective event that a group of artists in Shanghai did a few years ago called Jump. There was 20 or something artists that they jumped from, I think, 3rd, 4th floor of the building or something like that. This is what he actually did, and then he reperformed the piece in the Eiling Foundation space where we actually had the performance evening. And again, the Fluxes, George Brecht, Gao Mingyan, the guy that you saw playing golf in a public space. He took his own body as a canister, and he's been drinking a lot of vodka to make a sound performance. But I think what is interesting about the project, that during the 1 year we had a really regular audience who's been following this project for month to month, around 200 people. And this is, you have to see this video, but I didn't bring it with me. Reference to Manzoni's work, where he made this magical stand and the artist himself standing, and then Lu Pingyan made a stand of same height as himself and the same width, and then he tried to become a ready-made. So he's been trying to climb all over and over again on the stand. And this has a lot of reference. If you go back around 2010, Marina Abramovic had a MoMA solo show, and then a year later, or before, Tino Segal had a show in Guggenheim, so there was a lot of discussion about artists as a ready-made, etc. So this was his kind of response to this discussion, and finally he became ready-made. And then through the project, I introduced a group of international artists who are working with the live-based works throughout the videos or live performance in theater. This is Besto Rivas, it's collective from Barcelona. We did a live performance, The Human of the Future. Antti Laitinen, he's going to be in a Norwegian pavilion this year in Venice. He made this beautiful piece, Snowman. He was just standing in front of the Rockaband Art Museum and being a snowman for hours. We had Tino Segal's 2 works in 3 different museums during a few months. And this is again the guy, Hu Shenxian, Spies, the one who has a museum in his own head. He made this piece called Diagram for Speed, where he actually made a running track in the gallery, and if you see the wire on the left-hand side, it's actually electricity that is applied. So we had 2 judges who give a sign with a pistol, and they turn on the electricity, and he's been basically competing with power all the time, over and over again. This is a very interesting collective from France called Les Gens des Utopans, where they basically work directly with the audience and their own bodies. And it's called caster because it comes from the cast. They've been actually casting the audience, but the audience didn't really understand the situation. So the audience was coming in the space in groups of 10 or 5 people. And they will meet the artists, and the artists will tell them what to do, and they will be eliminated without any explanation. So some of them will experience the work for 10 seconds. Artists will just say, "You, go away." Or some of them will stay until the end. So this is the waiting, which was, and that's them greeting the new people and asking audience to do very different things with their bodies. This is yeah, and this is a work of Karen Sitter. She works a lot with film and video, but she also does theater pieces called Showreel Drama that we showed in Shanghai and Beijing. And of course, Marina's work, but actually what we did is a presentation of Marina Abramović Institute and her understanding of teaching methods of the performance and live-based works. So I don't know how I can keep talking for but yeah. Maybe Wenfeng has some questions. So I think in my work there is the issue of institution and institutional critique is very much present, and I'm working towards exhibition that will be presented in the Times Museum in Guangzhou end of June, that is called One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, Us and Institution, Us as Institution. And it's an international exhibition that looks at the problematics of institutional critique being institution as a state or art museum or art system as an institution. And throughout the throughout the group exhibition there will be a solo show of very important artist from Croatia that I deeply admired, Mladen Stilinović, who has been thinking about institution and how actually our definition of institution changed during the last 30 years, and how artists actually respond to the formation of the understanding of institution. So,
Okay. Yeah, actually you present so much things, and how my questions I prepared is now it's become you have answers. So I don't know how to start. So
maybe I can ask you a question.
Oh, okay. I think let me start with a question about, because you talk about a lot about institution, and so your work as a curator, I think, is from 2004 in Donner Museum. In that time, Donner Museum it was a very important state-funded contemporary museum. So I think for the and also it has a lot of contact with the local art. But in 2006, 2007, and the museum suddenly changed, and some very key persons, like in the curatorial team as you, left from this museum. So I think that's very important experience for you to know, to understand the institution in that local context. So could you please talk a little bit more about your cognition about that situation? Yeah?
So yeah, I think that was a very, this was my first job, and I think when the director left and we decided to leave, it was very difficult for me emotionally, because we had a really strong belief that we can make this institution working and contributing to the local context. So when we were decided to leave, it was really end of the world for me. And I sound super naive at the moment, but I think it was very difficult for me to understand that this institution is not going to work properly. And I think that acknowledgement actually, it's a very cruel reality of many institutions today in China, that there's a lot of museums that is built, but they're just empty boxes without any vision how they can contribute to the scene. And a lot of course, there is a lot of interest in China internationally, and there is a lot of international exhibitions that they come, but they land into the local context without any contribution, and it's just a waste of money and the time. So, and I think this is the kind of reality that I'm working with, and but again, as I work with institutions in China, and they're mostly these museums, because I don't work with the commercial sector, I try throughout my own curatorial practice to kind of make interventions into their programming with my ideas and issues that I think it's important to be brought upon at a certain point of time. So I think keeping this conversation with them all the time is also a very important self-learning experience for me, to understand how these institutions are changing throughout the time, because they are my collaborators. But again, for them also to understand my curatorial practice and the work of artists that I think it's important to be presented. So for me it's important that I keep this relationship that is kind of ongoing, and it kind of progresses throughout different periods of time on the different levels, if I reply to your question.
Yeah, because you always called your curating work as a curating intervention. And so it means, because in this local context, I think as an independent curator, it means you, I'll say you need a very special strategy to negotiate with the the space and especially the because I think a lot of museums or art space in Shanghai, they don't have very a long perspective to curating. So your work is more like the intervention. So to be independent, I think what is the most important thing for you to be independent?
To be independent. No, I think it's. I think leaving the museum, I think it helped me to contextualize my curatorial practice and understand more what I can do and what is needed to be done. And I think many of my projects are very long-term research projects, and I think including the archiving project and the retrospective exhibition that I mentioned, and they're all like 1 year, 2 years like projects, and I think at this point I can only do it independently. But of course I keep collaborating with very different institutions to make these things happen. But I think for me it's important to continue the research, that I think it's worth doing it, I guess. Yeah.
Because I mean, in China, it's the museum always appear and disappear very fast. So I mean, like this year, 3 very big private museums, and each of them is more than 10,000 square meters, will open in Shanghai. And also because I also work in Zhendai MoMA. It was a private museum, and in 2011, when we prepare like a Shanghai Tenare, this kind of exhibition for the opening of because the museum will be changed as a Himalaya Art Center. So, but suddenly the head of the group who invested this museum, suddenly he changed his idea, and so the whole concept disappeared. We should give up, and they changed the direction. So all the things disappeared. So so this so many private museum and also state museum, and so huge museums established in like this Shanghai local context, but actually
in China.
in China. So how, like in Shanghai, how it relate to the local?
To the global?
No, local art context.
The museums, I don't, at the moment, you say at the moment, now?
Yeah.
I don't think they contribute. No. No, I'm serious. I mean, I know it's very radical that I say that, but I think it's at this point I don't see the institution that in Shanghai speaking can contribute to the local and has a sustainable way of contributing to the local. I think there are a few institutions that actually appeared in the last few years, and few institutional changes that I think they're interesting, and they're interesting to look at in terms of the format, because they are not collection oriented, so it could be somehow related to the Kunsthalle formats that we have in Europe, are the OCAT, which is Contemporary Art Center in Shenzhen, because the very good curator from China, Carol Lu, became a director, and another one, which is the Times Museum, which is again real estate funded museum in Guangzhou, and they have a very interesting curatorial approach and to their programming, including the education and things. So I think it's interesting to see that in the last maybe 2-3 years, these institutional formats that are more or less innovative and kind of trying to find a way of working in a local context are not really in the big cities like in Beijing or Shanghai, but they're rather in the smaller cities like Guangzhou or Shenzhen, but they, throughout their program, they have a certain outreach, which I think is very important, and they contribute to the knowledge production, yeah.
Because beside the gallery, commercial gallery and museums, it's we can say the middle level or institution is almost not exist. So like some experimental non-profit art space. So I think it's this situation is really difficult, especially for the young artists, because it's I think it's very difficult for them to like find foundation or space to show the work. So, but in your curating work, because it's I found it's very interesting because you always develop a project with the artist. So, like the taking over the stage. So, I mean, first is the real performance. It's the young artist restart the Western history. Actually, it's like restart the art history, and but actually in 80s.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, also, I mean, that in that time, the artists, we can call also young artists, they also study the Western art history. So, but maybe the interpretation or the way is different. So, could you please talk about this?
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting that actually all the works that artists choose, they choose themselves, and none of them actually choose any of the Chinese artists' works, or it's really Western artists mostly. Maybe it's lack of understanding, or I don't really know, but that came out to be. But I think it's very different the way that they use their own body, I think, and I think it's in a way much more subtle. And we were actually looking at them when they came to do a performance that evening. They were all very nicely dressed in the black pants and the white shirts, like coming for a meeting or whatever, or a black shirt. So I think it's a very different approach to their own bodies, I guess. Although I think many of them would probably not continue doing a performance, but I thought that's important experience for them to have in their practice.
You promote the live art and performance and I would say intervention art a lot in your curating work. So I think the live art or performance art in the worldwide is a little bit on the margin. So why do you think it's important to promote this art in China?
Well, I don't think I really did a lot to promote live-based works. I think I did only that project and a few smaller projects before that were more of the necessity doing interventions because we didn't have a space. But I think for this specific project, I really wanted to bring part of the discussion related to live-based works in China, and I think somehow after the project a lot of artists continued having certain performative aspects throughout their work, which I think it actually came out of these discussions that this project actually brought. But I think my interest is really in artistic practices that are kind of resisting to these protocols of art systems and art system and the way it requests us to work. So yeah. But I don't think it doesn't necessarily relate to any media. I think yeah.
So resistance as a attitude.
I think yeah, we need to question certain protocols of the art system as an institution, because today art system is an institution. Yeah.
Yeah. So you did very details. I'll say local art history. I mean, it's not only Shanghai's local art history. Yeah. It's also the South, especially South Asia's local art history. So so how do you I'll say, because you start to make Shanghai's local history, and then maybe you find this has some connection with the other region, and
you mean how it started, how it developed, or what?
Yeah, how I mean Shanghai's local art, local context relate to the South, maybe South Asia.
Well, I don't think that Shanghai only relates. That's why the research is expanded on China history of exhibitions, and I think exhibition as a format is the way I work. So I think for me, understanding the history of exhibition in the place where I am at, it's very important, because there is very little known about it. And again, in many places in Southeast Asia, avant-garde movements happened before the China. So if you look at, for example, Malaysia or Philippines, avant-garde exhibitions started during the 70s when China was, or 60s even, when China was still under Cultural Revolution. But then later on, these so-called internationalization processes that happened during the 90s actually are happening in a simultaneous way at the same time. So I think there's certain dynamics and interesting possibilities for further comparative research that could be done on the history of exhibitions in the region.
Because your background, I think, is from the East European, Serbia, and it's because I mean, if you compare with China, we share the same experiences after the communism movement, and capitalism is really occupying the whole social really quickly. So actually, I think we share, because the contemporality is informing. We can share this kind of same experience in this process. So
yeah, I mean there are similar processes, and although I'm from Serbia, I cannot say that I contributed that much to Serbian art scene because I'm so far away, but I try to keep the track of what's going on. But I think my big inspiration for my work and some kind of a historical research, it's a Slovenian collective that you all might know called Irwin, when they started working on East Art Map in early 2000, saying that actually Western avant-garde and development of contemporary art practice is very different from the one that happened in the Eastern Europe. So they said history is not made, so you need to construct it. And I think this is very much inspiration for my work and my historical research in the place where I work at the moment. So I think there are definitely certain parallels, especially when we look at the self-historization processes that Eastern Europe went through, and that probably China and Southeast Asia is going to come into on the next phase. Yes.
Okay, my question finished.
You don't have any more questions?
I have a lot, but
yeah, sure.
I have two questions, but they're connected.
Yeah,
the first
sure.
is with respect to your own role and the role that you see yourself playing.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe even in terms of what is a curator, what would a curator be doing, what should a curator be doing. So how you understand your position with respect also to the pressures that you're facing and the things that you want to do and are not able to do and things that you find yourself doing. And then secondly, you said a lot about context and about local context.
Yeah.
But you didn't speak so directly about it.
No.
And I'm curious to know how you understand that, even that term context. Is it really the context of local art production? Or is it a wider context? And then also with respect to the artists, how they are contributing to their context, and how you want to somehow facilitate certain actions or not?
Thanks, it's a good question. The first one. I was lucky enough that I could do all the projects that I want to do, using my own ways to do it. So, of course, there is a lot of pressure and frustration because whenever I want to do a project, I have to start from the scratch. But I somehow managed to do things and make things happen, which is, you could explain that I'm stubborn enough or whatever, but I would say I was lucky enough that certain people that I approached to, that they're willing to support the projects that I am trying to do or that I think they're of importance to do. But I think my curatorial role in the local context, besides, I think, exhibition making, in some ways and in some cases is also taking a role of some kind of a mediator, that, like, I do very different things, like, I've been trying to send a lot of younger Chinese artists to the international residency programs, for example, and this is not very specifically related to my curatorial research, work and exhibition making, but I think it's important that artists have this kind of experience, and then when they come back, they can look at the local art scene with a little bit different perspective. And again, there's one thing, and then I always try to because I decided not to have a space of my own, because I think there is a lot of spaces in China that are lacking the content, because a lot of people ask me why you don't have an art center or whatever. But I think, so I try throughout my projects to kind of establish these platforms that artists, after my project ends, the artists can keep working with and using it as a possible support. So there is a project that I finished recently, for example, a lot of not-for-profit spaces closed after the expo in Shanghai. So there is only one not-for-profit called AM Space working, and they don't have a funding, they pay out of their pockets. Very young couple. But then I convinced the Goethe Institute to open an art space called Goethe Open Space in Shanghai. They never did anything related to contemporary art. They showed German movies, usually. And then they started showing younger artist works, and then after my exhibition ends, for example, they will have an open call for the young curators so they can do exhibition there. So I think it's also kind of providing a certain possibilities and the platform for the artists and the curators. Yeah, did I reply?
I mean, it's an endless answer.
Yeah, I know. It's, but these are a few things that I can, and then related to the local context, I think it's a very, very complicated, because I work as a foreigner, and I'm not the only foreigner working, of course, in China, but I think it's a very thin line of being a foreigner and not being a foreigner, and being accepted by the local art scene. I had a discussion with the German artists beforehand about this issue, and I think there is very little on art historical research and reflection in the last 30 years what happened. And I think this is extremely important for my personal work, being and living there. So, and throughout my work and my interest, I can bring in those materials for the people who are willing to do it, further look at it. I can only do that much from my own personal contribution. So, yeah. Yes?
Two questions. One is more informative.
Yes.
Do you collaborate with the archives that have been established by Hans van Dyck and now continued in Hong Kong? Do you collaborate with them? Because they are quite parallel. No?
Yes.
What you
yes.
Okay. Just for my...
Yeah.
I don't know if I got it right, but you're working between two poles which are interrelated.
Mm.
One is the state art scene, building museums all over the country, kind of trying to use art as a tool of power, of cultural domination, if I see that right. And that's the museums you were talking about. And the other hand is, on the other hand, is the commercial part. You know, there's a very strong commercialization of Chinese art during all the period ever since the 80s, and which is, in my opinion, is very strongly influencing the quality of art. So if I got you right, you try to be independent between these two poles, interrelated poles, because they're collaborating all the time, of course. Chinese artist who is important is one who makes a lot of money in official views. You know. So could you go more into detail about your position in between commercialization? People have to live; they have to sell their pictures, no? Haven't they?
Yeah,
So,
but nothing to do with me. They can sell their pictures.
That's yeah. So, but these poles, could you?
Yeah, understand. The first question, there is a Asia Art Archive that is an institution that has been doing archiving processes since last 10 or more years, and it's based in Hong Kong. And they're also archiving Hans Archive. It's a foreign curator and a critic who lived in Beijing for many years, and he did a very important work. He unfortunately died a few years ago. And Asia Archive has been doing a very important job in archiving throughout the Asia contemporary art practice. They recently did a very big project on the 80s in China. The whole interviews and everything is online, so if you're interested you can have a look at. I haven't worked with them on my history of exhibition archives. They approached to me that I donate the archive, my copy of the archive to them, yes. And probably one copy will go to them at one point, maybe not now, but I think it's important that this archive, which is really much local related, stays in Shanghai. And unfortunately till today I haven't found the institution that is willing to have it. Because I have a request that they need to continue the archiving process, so they cannot just pick up what I have and then just throw it in the office. Yeah, so if I answer the first question, yes? Yeah, so the second one is, in terms of institutional structures, you mentioned the state-funded museums. And then you have also private funded museums. Private funded museums are mostly run by the real estate companies because they own the land, and then if they want to build a museum on the land, they would have some kind of tax deduction from the local government. So, and the museum that, for example, Wenfeng mentioned, Zhendai Museum is a real estate museum. I work in a dome, which is state museum, and to be very honest with you, I really try to keep distance from the state museums and the way they work, because it only causes the problems. I worked on the last project for Shanghai Biennale, and it's a very problematic, unfortunately. But I think at some point they would have to rethink their structures and the infrastructure that actually can work in China. So many of my projects actually happen with in the private museums, and Shanghai has a number of private museums. Beijing has none, basically. There is only one, which is Today Art Museum. To be very honest, I am very actively withdrawn from the commercial art sector myself because I'm not very much interested in the market, and it was never interest to me. So I try to do fundraising of my projects to a very different networks and opportunities, and it's always very, very difficult, but I rarely work with the commercial sector, and almost never. So, but I think it's always a challenge when I want to start the project and discuss with the institution to host it, because they need to understand it, and we need to have a mutual understanding of the value of certain project to be presented at a certain time. It's not just me intervening in the space for 2 months or one night. It's really kind of establishing relation between me and the institution to have a commitment to these projects. And I think it's an important intervention that I'm trying to do, because it has this conversation with institutional structure ongoing. yeah. I think this, you've been waiting, sorry.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy that you brought up infrastructure now. You said your practice relates to institutional critique in the context of China, but also in general. I wanted to know what you think about, there seems to me, working as an artist also in relation to institutional critique, there seems to be a shift in the generation now into a higher consideration of the potentiality of building infrastructures in relation to institution, in the, what is the new institutional critique. Like, whereas like Michael Asher or people like that were more focused on the negativity of the institution. Now, artists like Jonas Stahl in Europe or Camp Collective in India and also Rax Media Collective, they are focusing more on the infrastructure building within the institutional critique. How could you relate to that, or in China?
Thank you. It's interesting that you brought this. Institutional critique in China is another issue that is really rarely discussed and contextualized. There was something that existed as institutional critique in 80s, and I think it was very, very strong, especially throughout the work of Xiamen Dada. You have to look at it. It spells X-I-A, Xiamen. It's a city in south of China, and one of the core members of Xiamen Dada is the artist called Huan Yongping, who now lives in Paris. And they did this throughout 1986 and 1987, did a series of interventions that were directly criticizing institution, museum as the way of framing artworks and contextualizing this public appearance of the artworks. They did some really, really amazing work, and I'm trying to include part of the archive from these practices in my next exhibition. But then, of course, in 1989, this was stopped after the Tiananmen. And I think many of the artists in China kind of became very distant from the local institution because international interest in China started in the 90s. But I think it's interesting, and I think it somehow relates to your question, that in last 4 years, I can see in the younger generation of artists that there is this reflection on the relationship between them and the art system and institution. And I think it's very early to talk about new wave of institutional critique because they are very, very young. But I think they are intensively thinking about this issue, and I think it could be a very important contribution that we can see from their practice if they continue this way in like future 5 years or something like that. But there is a work, I'm not really sure, is it still in the House de Cultura de Welt? There is this former West exhibition that was, oh okay, then never mind. There is one piece by a very young artist called Li Ran, that I think it's also, he's one of them that you can look at. But I think there are artists who start to kind of reflect on this issue, but I don't think there is but nothing like in India in a way that you mentioned, Rax Media Collective. I think it's still a little bit early to contextualize them in that way.
Is China maybe also a less NGO-intense area? Because in India this happened also because there are so many NGOs, over 28,000.
There are NGOs, but they don't really work in contemporary art context. But they are not that present as in India, I would say. I think as, yes?
Two, three aspects. One is, I was surprised that you use so much the word intervention.
He used, not me.
You use it too.
Okay.
Intervene, and maybe to come closer to the next question, the category of self-exposure in the context is less related to a hierarchy, because intervention demonstrates always a stronger power that you are able to intervene, otherwise you will be rejected or defeated. The other point is, could you give some examples or categories or hints when you will give the label to an exhibition, and the label is related to local context. What must have been happened? And the third aspect is, we can't solve it this evening, I'm sure, when we look to the self-naming or the self-labeling categories of exhibition makers. We know all that curator was a word not used till 15 years ago very much. Yeah. And so if you look at the history of the self-labeling of these people who hang or organize exhibitions, if we continue with this category of being a curator, we are always trapped in this apparatic construction that we can't solve the problem. We have only the idea of a strong intervention. So it's a difficult construction, and maybe, but the focus of my question is labeling that, or giving some hints. What is the local relation you are looking for, and when does it happen? The content.
It reminds me a little bit on your class practice, isn't it? Exercise. The first was yeah, I know. Let me just the intervention issue, right? The one of the first. Well, I think I find and I place myself in a very equal position as any institution. So I could be institution, you could be institution. So I think in order to make things happen, we need to have some kind of equal dialogue, be it individual or institution, because I think this is very important in my work. Related to the history of exhibitions, I think it's a slightly different from this curating history. And I am not specifically looking at the curating history, but more on history of exhibitions. And I think you're all right about labeling and things like that. We know all about, but I think my interest is really at looking at the because the exhibitions that we are looking maybe through this seminar are basically, most of them, the artist organized exhibition, and artists were the ones who actually made some of the most important exhibitions throughout the last 30 years. Speaking of China or any other locality in Southeast Asia speaking. So, and I think these exhibitions, we know very little about them, and I spend a lot of time trying to work with the local curators and critics who are interested to do a further research, because I don't know the language, and I think this archive should stay in the local context. So they should do a research, but I try to animate them that this research is done, because it's very little known about these exhibitions globally, and I think these studies can contribute to our understanding of exhibition making in that part of the world. Yeah, and your question, the exercise, what I search for the local, right?
No. What must be given as a given fact when you would say now there is a certain approach, successful approach to have art to be related to the local? Because I asked this when I asked artists in the 90s to imagine the future in 10 years. So it will be 2005. They're all thinking cars and buildings and all this high technology. When I asked 2002, they want to sit at a creek, have a tea in a land house, and so on and so on. So the fascination of the local, which happened perhaps in Europe with this refascination of the local and ecological movement and so on and so on, is perhaps a turning point. And I don't know if there is a romantic perspective, which with a fantasy and imagination category, which is backwards and not building the next future as an idea of a future home. So this local could be very archaic, rude, conservative, and so on and so on and so on. It's not a space of of freedom and rescue of this institutional, being trapped institutionally. So the fascination is related to the question, what is your focus to prove this contextual relation with an exhibition?
I don't think there is an answer to this. I think these are negotiations that I kind of try to start throughout the exhibition. I think they are just negotiation processes that are evolving, and many of them fail, but some of them maybe succeed in bringing certain contributions. Yeah. Yes.
One more question.
Oh.
You mentioned so many museums, and museums that have been built in Shanghai in recent years, and also are just going to be opened this year and next year. And I wonder what they should show. It's very strange to me when I see the Sendai, for example, and where you both worked. Yes.
Yeah.
The Sendai did a good job, I think, in making exhibitions of, for example, single exhibition of Songdong or Yang Fudong or Qiuzhijie.
Yes.
And they did a very good job because it was the first really one-man show in the south or in the middle China. So, but when I see the new museums like the Himalaya with over 10,000 square meters, what do you know what they are going to show?
Yes. No, I don't really know. I really don't know. And I think I don't want to know because I think that's the issue that have to solve themselves. But Himalaya is totally a different issue now.
But isn't this the same problem with the new Max Museum in Rome? And
yes,
so
exactly.
why?
Exactly.
Are there the same reasons or is it for different reasons? I was there last year. It was so disappointing and self-referential. They show in the cantina, they show photos of the new museum beside in the old house where the cantina or the restaurant is in, and inside the building they show the 5 workout, how do you say that, Vorschläge, Anträge, proposals for how to do the yard in front of the building. I mean, you can see it out there, the one which was built and 5 other proposals inside. I mean, this is nothing.
Yeah, but I think that's...
And there was not more to see.
Yeah, but I think that's very interesting because it's not only, I think, China issue in a way. And I think understanding of institution, I think we need to question why you cannot be institution yourself. I mean, what stops you just not having a big enough space to claim yourself? I mean, you know what I mean? Yeah, because we are really so used to this structure and we are so comfortable with it that we really don't question this issue in the core of it. Like why you cannot be a museum yourself. I mean, if we would be, each one of us, the museum, I think our world would be very, very different in a way. Yeah.
It's power and money. That's a true factor.
I don't believe in this. And you can call me naive, but I'm happy to be naive.
I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about the...
Yeah. Because I think people that I shown in this exhibition in Manchester, they don't have a power and they sure don't have money. But they are all doing their small institutions and they're doing the things that they think it's important to be done. And I think this is the most important thing in the world for all of us, especially working in so-called contemporary art.
Yeah, but these are your big enemies, you know. That's the ones against whom you do the Sisyphus work.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, are these Chinese artists with whom you were working, are they like commercially unsuccessful or successful? Or what is the difference between them and commercially successful Chinese artists? Are they better or I don't know? And second, here being in Berlin, I know for already 2 or 3 years, I see, for example, there is no comparison between Japanese and Chinese artists. And you were never mentioning also, because you were speaking that you're working on this Southeast. So is there... Yeah, okay, never mind, you understand me. So is it, they are different because I did not hear Japan for these 2 hours? Although this national selection are passé.
Okay.
And so.
Okay, thank you. The first one was, when you say commercially successful, the artist who sells high prices and, right?
Or live from art.
I think all of the artists that I shown, I think some of them are very commercially successful, but they sell for very high prices, but I think this is not the most important thing of their contribution. They really contribute as something to the art system. And for example, in my next show, I'm showing the very old abstract artist. He's 70, but he can sell for very high prices. Younger artists, some of them they have galleries, some of them not, but it's always easy to sell non-paintings, if you want to say. So it's always a challenge for them. So I think it's a mixture of different artists, and I think it really depends on my exhibitions. The second thing about Japan, it's interesting. Why I didn't mention Japan in these few projects, because for example, in this Institution for the Future exhibition that I did, I was actually looking at the localities who don't have an institutional infrastructure that is sustainable, like in China or Japan and Korea. They have their own institutional infrastructure and the funding system that is in a way similar to Europe. It's a slightly different, I would say, but it has its own infrastructure. So for this specific thing, it wasn't my focus. But the other thing is very interesting is that you brought this in relationship between Japan and China, which I think it's also very, I think it's a discussion for another talk that you can organize next time. But there are very different dynamics, and I think the certain historical relations and Japan wall, I think, and these memories are still very much existent, if Wenfeng would agree. But I think, I'm talking about the general people, but I think artists are still going beyond this, how would I say, generalization of Serbians are like this and Germans are like that. And there is, for example, a collective called Xijinmen, and there is in this collective there is an artist from China, Chen Shaoxiong, and then an artist from Japan, and another artist is from Korea. So there are collaborations. Yes. Yeah.
Next up, I think if you still have energy, we can see some Chinese young artists work. And I select seven artists' work, also include me. So it will take 15 minutes.